Right, good morning. I hope you all are very much following the handouts shared in last couple of weeks. We are still continuing with the central bank handout, the Federal Reserve System, and also we'll be able to start the discussion on money supply process anytime soon today. And I hope you all have kind of have a clarity in terms of what we discussed with respect to central bank, particularly the Federal Reserve System and the Monetary Board and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka to a great extent. While this being said, I'll also keep again reminded you all, please have any clarifications required raised, if not shared with me or the others through the chat mode, so we'll be able to respond while the discussion continues. And the discussion with respect to the central banks, we came to the point where we were discussing about the central bank's independence, and particularly we were discussing goal and instrument independence with respect to the Fed Reserve, but the details with respect to the Fed Reserve would not necessarily restrict to the US central bank alone. The independence arising from goal and the instrument is an important yardstick through which central banks could perform its function without having any influence from third parties, particularly the government, or for that matter, parliament or the Ministry of Finance. That's the kind of, the centers through which central bank independence could be challenged. But when you say goal independence, it gives the central bank the ability to choose the final goal of monetary policy, right? It gives the central bank the ability to choose the final goal of the monetary policy. But when we say instrument independence, it gives the central bank the ability to decide the instruments it will use to pursue the so-called final goals of monetary policy established. Right? So to say, try to understand the difference. I mean, the goal is the final objective or the final purpose to which the central bank is established, and central bank has a say on establishing it. When it comes to instrument independence, that means type of instruments that they can choose in order to achieve the said goal independence that you have defined. In most countries, including most of the developed countries that you are familiar with, the goals have been very much established through Congress, Senate, or a parliamentary process. But that does not mean that those goals been established without having adequate brainstorming, adequate discussions, or inputs from central bankers, central banks, academia, that has a great deal of consultation all throughout. But to the extent where this goal is established, once it's established, most of the time it's the Parliament, Congress, or Senate, as I was mentioning. They have the power to pass the legislations. So through these legislations, they have the ultimate decision with respect to what to be established. But through a proper consultation process, most of the countries follow these goal establishment of central banks. Even when it comes to amendments of such goals, the consultation to great extent being followed. That is no different in most of the cases. And even in the case of Sri Lanka in 2004-5, the Monetary Law Act was amended to bring in both price and economic stability and financial system stability as the goals of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Right? Prior to that, there were quite a detail of objectives, more or less, the price and economic stability and financial system stability is now the objective of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, passed as an amendment to the Monetary Law Act. Right? So this has some influence of course, the academia, the central bankers, and the consultation process usually have in the case of Sri Lanka too, because once you set up a particular bill that's been listed for debate in the parliament, you give a certain time window where even general public could challenge if they simply see it has clauses which are not in line with the constitution. That process is very much enshrined and established in Sri Lanka's legislation, if not legislative enactment process. So that's something you could say still, I mean, although it's been passed by the parliaments, senates, congresses of different jurisdictions, still some consultative mechanism is available. But interestingly, what you had to see is the instruments that the central banks choose and how its ability to kind of employ such instruments in achieving those goals. Right? So goals being very much now clear, the instrument will come particularly in terms of discussing conventional monetary policy instruments against non-conventional monetary policy instruments. Mostly the conventional monetary policy instruments you have seen in the chart where we discussed about the Fed Reserve structure. Then ultimately you have three types of instruments: statutory reserve requirement or reserve ratios, open market operation or discount rates, right? This is also important open market operations and interest rates, right? These are the very, very interesting and important yardsticks in terms of central banks following the operation. I'll show you the chart again to refresh your minds. It's here. Reserve requirements, open market operation, discount rate. So these are the policy tools. Within this, the instruments being defined, I mean, instruments to say interest rates when it comes to discount rates being defined, reserve requirement maintained in terms of reserve ratios, open market operations, you have either injection or absorption, or there are various type of liquidity and other temporary facilitation arrangements central banks facilitate. We will discuss this in details in one of our next lectures. So to say this instrument, you have now seen the most of the central banks have these elements at least in books, right? So the independence of these central banks being measured on the basis of not only the availability but also in terms of applicability and the independence, if not the freedom through which that they implement those, whether the other agencies I was referring influence them in such applications. That's very important when central bank want to increase interest rates, whether there are resistance rising outside the central bank in terms of adjusting the interest rates, right? So that's very important because probably the governments would have the feel when interest rate increases because their budgetary finance cost increases. As a result, deficit related additional interest payments arise in their books, right? The central banks would try to do open market operations to reduce the market liquidity, thereby money supply being adjusted, and through which what you simply see is interest rates being pressurized. So these are all variables that influences ultimately the financing side of the budgets, and then of course sometimes on the basis of where the interest rates and the economic activities correlates, maybe even the economic activities could get slowed down. So there's a significant element here. So the agencies outside central bank could influence central bank on that basis. So that's also an area where you keep a close eye on in terms of defining how independent is the central bank, right? So to great extent, these were embedded in the legislations and then subsequently in terms of central banks operations being analyzed. Then the revenue side. If central bank is relying on its revenue from the general treasury, budgetary allocation through annual budgets, so naturally you depend on ministry to kind of maintain your operation. So to great extent, all around the world, except very few cases, the revenue independence is with central banks. They can generate their own revenue through various type of activities and operations enshrined, and even currency issuance of currency is rest with the central bank. So you see between the face value and the cost of currency printing, you probably see there's a substantive value that itself a profit, but that profit is actually ultimately passed on. All the profit central banks generate ultimately pass on to the government. You share the profits, right? Of course, you share a part of that for the reserves that you maintain. But at the same time, ultimately it belongs to the government, because government has given the authority to the central banks with respect to its operation. So these being channeled. But you should have the sources and you should have mechanisms to generate your revenue, either through your reserves, in international reserves that you manage, or your open market operations you carry out, or your activities in terms of regulation, supervision related activities. But central banks carry out those without charging the financial intermediaries. But at the same time, the central banks could have those also been facilitated capacity development initiatives you can charge. There are various ways. Then the currency, as I was mentioning, right, through open market operations, there are various ways of you can generate revenue. So these revenues have to be independent from reliance upon a government or a ministry's cash flow arrangements. So that would also sets how independent these institutions are, right? Then, of course, there may be arguments, although you have the jurisdictions, and this has been written by the Congress or Parliament for that matter in Sri Lanka, and subject to change. Parliaments can change these jurisdictions, right? So they can change, but I mean, bull in a China shop, like nobody goes and change this legislation, right? That would have severe repercussions to the entire economy and the financial system, as well as the credibility of the government in operation. So most of the time, the Congress parliaments are mindful when it comes to a legislation of this nature tampered with. They are very mindful of those elements and the repercussions it arise. But who knows? It all depends on the people who are there in those legislations. So legislature, yeah, who are there in legislature. So to say that we have to be mindful of the fact that it's been written and passed by Parliament or Congress and subject to change at any time. So to say that ultimately, even if you have established goal and defined instruments, but the possibility that the Parliament could amend, change those things are there. Then you see executive influence. Presidential influence is executive authority of a country, right? So executive influence also matters when it comes to independence. Then the executive influence could be through the influence of parliament or the Congress, appointment of members to governing bodies. In the case of Fed, the Board of Governors, and in the case of Sri Lanka, the monetary board, right? And even key senior appointments like deputy governors in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka's case, that has to then go through the vetting by the minister, right? So in charge of the subject finance. Then, of course, appointment of chairman. Fed Reserve's chairman is equivalent to governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Although terms are not concurrent. Terms are not concurrent in the sense the government's term versus the chairman's term. That means once you appoint the chairman in the case of Fed Reserve, he goes for a 4-year tenure, right? Whether the 4-year matches with the government in power or not, that's a different ball game altogether. In the case of Sri Lanka now, once appointed, or one term of a governor is 6 years, right? So the parliament and presidential terms are now reduced to 5 years from previous 6, right? So invariably that signals governor could continue. But most of the time what happened is with the change of governments, they also step down because some of the appointments comes with the government changes. So we have seen that frequently, particularly in countries in the developing and frontier markets economies. In advanced economies, I have seen last time, it is Bernanke, Professor Bernanke. He continued to be the chairman of Fed Reserve, and subsequently they appointed the Janet Yellen. She's now the Secretary of the Treasury in US. Right now, Jerome Powell is the chairman. I was mentioning some of these names in our last discussion too, right? So there is a possibility in those economies, the governors or the chairmen still continue irrespective of change or presidential periods being not necessarily matches with the period or the terms of the heads of these central banks or monetary authorities, right? So they could have multiple roles in multiple periods in the case of Sri Lanka as well as in the Fed Reserve. 4-year single term, that could be another 4-year, but overall 14 years for a member in the Board of Governors. Once appointed, a single term, 14 years. We discussed these things. They could have much more independence in terms of continuity. They can step down before, that's a usual process that we also have seen, but they could still continue. So that itself define the ability of those agencies to maintain their independence when there's a kind of influence arising from changes in government and things like that. Then the appointments, whether these appointments are presidential, most of the time yes, with the executive consent. And now in Sri Lanka's case, you also have high post parliamentary committee that also has to clear. And in the case of Monetary Law Act, you have to have the consent of the minister who oversee the subject finance as well. So these are very interesting facts within this that establishes the how independent they are in terms of their engagement, but at the same time that itself sets possibilities that how partial these chairmen or the governors in terms of their affiliations to different governments in authority or power, right? So you can kind of I leave that to be kind of explored, discussed, and brainstormed within you all to kind of, come out with your judgment in terms of how best to see. We can go on. The arguments being discussed on this basis. Any question before that? You can raise if you have questions in terms of queries that I might discuss here. Right. So should the central bank or the Fed be independent? There are arguments for as well as arguments against. Right? So the strongest argument for an independent central bank rests on the view that subjecting central banks to more political pressure would impart an inflationary bias to monetary policy. Right? So inflationary bias, that's very interesting, very important aspect, because most of the central bank, whether they have single objectives, multiple objectives, or dual objectives, you will see that possibility within the legislations that they've been established. Often look at price stability as one of the key, if not most important objective of the central bank. Price stability. That does not mean prices are stable. Price stability means low and stable inflation. Prices increases. You can't put them in a bottle and put the lid and keep. No. Prices would adjust with a lot of changes happening and based on development. But these changes or the increase that we usually see has to be reasonable, low. When it comes to reasonable low, one could say 5%, one could say 2%. It depends on the environment in which you operate. It's like growth. When you are small, you grow fast. But when you reach adulthood, your growth really reduces. I mean, you don't go on and grow once you reach 20, 21. Still you could, but after a point, it's not necessarily growing. It's like the business cycles. Once you reach the maturity of your economic cycle, and once your economy reach to a point, it has very much come to the capacity, the increases would happen in a snail pace. Very little changes. For them, even a change by 0.5% in absolute value, it's very big. For instance, 15 trillion economy, right? 15 trillion, 10% change is 1.5 trillion. 1% change is 150 billion. But for a 85 billion economy, 10% change is 8.5 billion. 1% change is 850 million, not even billion. So to say that the inflation, low and stable inflation, you define in terms of its level, where you are standing. But the important fact here is central banks are required to operate independently in order to manage this inflation. If you leave it to the influence of political authorities or the political pressures, they would always allow central bank to push for expansionary monetary policies. Expansionary monetary policies. Expansionary invariably says the interest rates to be maintained very much low levels, irrespective of consequences to the economic cycle. Central banks to facilitate at all points to expand the budgetary considerations. That means even if there's a substantially high budget deficits, central banks would continue to support those deficits, irrespective of whether you are in a very challenging pandemic, whatever circumstances, because the politicians are very much happy to go on and deliver handouts. They become Santa Clauses. They become very much Santas, and they wanted to distribute things that comes through, let's say, central bank's money, not by generating money through economic activities and, let's say, through budgetary processes, taxes, and other revenues the governments could have. So this would be inflationary if you try to do that beyond the levels that you establish. Usually, any country would have their economies growing, right? So that means from last year to this year, there's a possibility the money requirement changes with the change in economic activities or increase in economic activity. So you have to supplement that change. Then the value of money also deteriorate by the inflation from last year to this year. So that also need to be compensated. So you expect some adjustment in overall monetary conditions in an economy. But if you see that enhances beyond the required levels, that could impart possible inflationary pressures. Even inflation could come through exchange rate channel if your economy is reasonably dependent on imports, right? So the people who argue for independence to be given to central banks argue that the central bank should have the say in terms of managing this inflation. If you leave that to the hands of political authorities, political pressure, they would be biased towards inflation. And that would actually erode the real value of money in an economy over a period of time. So they don't want central banks being influenced by third forces, as I was explaining. So that's the argument for. So what's the argument against? Right? Even the proponents of a Fed, right, under the president or the Congress in US, still argue at times. I mean, it was very clear during President Donald Trump. He was openly criticizing the Fed Reserve chairman. I have seen he's openly coming out and in press conferences blasting off, irrespective of the decisions central banks have made. And he wants the central banks to act in line with his thinking. And he argues, and some of the other countries also argued at different points of time, it is undemocratic to have a monetary policy controlled by an elite group that is responsible to no one. This board of governors, monetary board, they say they are not responsible to anyone. Once appointed, they have independence. They don't have democratically given powers to execute those. That's the argument they bring. The political authority is democratically appointed. They would argue like that. So this is something very much comes with the consideration that they've been appointed the democratically, and the monetary boards or the board of governors, actually they've been engaged in those appointments through the appointment possibilities that we discussed in our previous slides as well. So to say that they are not answerable to anyone. So they do whatever may not necessarily be the will of the people. Right? So this is the argument, and they say that they are not responsible to anyone. And to great extent, I believe in today's context, The board of governors, the chairmen, the monetary boards, or the governors are responsible to answer to the parliamentary select committees. They've been called at independent audit follow-ups, and they've been exposed in the media, and also they've been now been again challenged through social media, and also their actions been widely and closely scrutinized, right? So they don't have escape if they do any action that is not in line with the expected directions of central bank. So it is not right that they are not responsible to anyone. The conclusion that they are not responsible to anyone no longer exists in modern economies, where you see they've been challenged, argued, and even been challenged at courts for various actions on a repetitive basis. And the argument of undemocratic is also, it's true. I mean, central bank governors normally don't appoint through a ballot or a kind of process like an election. That it's difficult and that cannot be. And then they've been appointed by the elected representatives in terms of required expertise that they possess, but you probably not necessarily seen that they be defined like you should have a PhD. No, not necessarily. Even if you don't have, if you have the required expertise, you can function. You should have that expertise in that field, and have the support of the technical staff who are reasonably having the required know-how and the possible advice that they extend. You have to kind of manage. It's a role that the governors play and the chairmen play in those agencies. So the argument against is on that basis. They simply say these agencies are not democratic, though, and we should not let these small group of, let's say, 12, if not 6 or 5, a very small number, to define the destiny of the economies in terms of their decisions in deciding interest rates, deciding how much of monetary stocks to be remain, various ways. So to say that this is the argument that they put forward. So the argument for, argument against, right? So when we discuss this point, because I'm giving reasonable priority to this area, because this is one topic this being discussed significantly in today's financial market literature, even in the case of Sri Lanka. So this is a very important area. That's why I take a little bit of time and effort in terms of taking you all through. Any questions before I move on on the same topic, same subject? Right. So the case for independence, as you already know, argument for independence for central banks already argued. You leave it at the hands of political authorities or the political pressure that would impart an inflationary bias to monetary policy. Monetary policy would not be independently perform its function in terms of achieving low and stable inflation. That is the price stability objective, right? So that's the main argument put forward for independence. Then you have to see this in line with political business cycle versus economic business cycle. You know, business cycles of economies, that's the over period of time, how the economies grow, not shorter duration. You take a longer duration and you can grow. There are periods that the economies are growing. That's the increasing trajectory of the business cycle. Then you probably find a point where the economies are peaking. That's the top of the mountain. where you grow and you see the economies have peaked in its growth cycle. Then again, you see a cycle where you are seeing a slope, you are coming down. That is the business cycles period where the growth is slowing. Still, economies are growing, but it is slowing at 5-8%. It has grown, but now it reached 8% level, and since then it is reducing to 6, 5, 4, 3 likewise, and then it's bottoming out. That's where the economic growth has come to a standstill, like where the growth has been basically, it's not necessarily required to reach the zero level. Could be a low growth, but settle. It's like in India, they call it Hindu level of growth. If you don't do anything, still India will grow by 1.5% or so, they simply say. So they define it like a Hindu economic growth because there are activities you have to perform from last year to this year. That happens in the general parlance in India. So they generally see that growth trajectory being maintained. So then again, you start a cycle where economy started to grow again. You probably acquired new capital, new mechanisms, new methods, new machinery. People become productive. Economy started growing. So the business cycles is that. So the duration of these business cycles varies, often longer than a political business cycle. Political business cycle is their election cycle. The 5-year cycles, 4-year cycles, you define it based on the election periods. So when you have election, you wanted to spend. Irrespective of the budgetary position, they want the budgets to expand. You wanted to finance through central banks. You wanted to finance through other government agencies. When the other government agencies do not have required resources, they come through the cash flow of the government, and the government's cash flow would depend on financing through borrowing or through central bank means. So the political business cycles are often biased, irrespective of your position in terms of the economic business cycle. When you see the economics business cycles are actually increasing at a pace which are beyond the capacity of the economy, in economic parlance, you call it overheating of the economy. That's like a vehicle has an engine capacity. That's the maximum speed at which you can drive. If you try to drive faster than that maximum levels being defined, if not orderly, comfortable levels of driving, the possibility that your vehicle could break down. So for the economies too, there's no difference. If you try to manage your economy by letting your economy to overheat, at any point economy will break down. That means that you are building inflationary pressures. So the business cycle based management would definitely look at, and they will try to see economies to not hard land. They will let economies to soft land. You know how a plane been landed. If you landed it soft, very smooth, no problem for the passengers, no problem for the runaways, no problem for the aeroplane. But if you hard land, you may even try a belly landing. The damage could be very difficult to project, forecast, and even you might see the entire aeroplane and the passengers would be in jeopardy. So you have to see this with the perspective of political business cycle versus economic business cycles. Political business cycle is always biased in terms of their re-election. So they would impart inflationary pressure, and case for independence argue you should not let down your guard for political business cycle. So you should protect against such because longer term welfare of the people and the economy that matters in terms of maintaining orderly financial and economic conditions in terms of the laid down objectives of central banks. Okay, so when the political business cycle is there, as I was mentioning, the political business cycle could be used to facilitate treasury financing of large budget deficits, right? So they are in favor of accommodation, right? So this is again something one could argue with budgetary financing being facilitated through central bank finances to the government. This is something people are repetitively arguing, repetitively looking at, right? So this is again facilitate in terms of independence, that if you argue for independence, you can elaborate on this. And the other thing is the independence of central banks is too important leave to politicians. The principal agent problem is worse for politicians. Politicians are whom? Agent. Who is the principal? The vote carrying people. But once they elected, they become principal, and the vote carrying people become agents. I mean, I'm telling you that you can see that's happening in most of the cases. But in reality, the politicians are the agents and the principals are the people. So as you know, principal agent problem that we were repetitively discussed, agents are maximizing their benefit irrespective of what the principals wanted in terms of the ideal, if not the standard operation modules for firms, institutions. Agents would not mind the lifetime of the machineries. They would be mindful of the fact that if you produce more, they have more profits. Whether the machinery lasts for its lifetime of 40 years or its breakdown in 15 years, they don't care. It's like you rent out your vehicle and somebody else is running your vehicle. You run, you are mindful of possible considerations, but if you let somebody to pay you a monthly rental and being used, very few of course would be mindful. But even there are systems to manage that. Beyond a certain mileage, you probably ask, but there are various ways through which things happen now. It's very difficult for you to kind of, make sure that the vehicle being maintained properly. So it is too important to leave it to politicians. The principal agent is worse in the politicians because they are mindful of their re-election than anything else. And they would not necessarily look at the benefits or the welfare of principals to great extent beyond a point. So this is the argument for independence, elaborated in line with the political pressure would impart inflationary bias. And we have very clearly said why independence is required, because political pressure are inflationary bias. And then you talked about against independence. As we discussed already, the argument of democratic consideration. They simply say it's undemocratic to handful of people, the board of governors, the monetary board, only few, to decide the complex economy, irrespective of the politicians who has people's will. So this is the argument maybe forward. Whether that's right, you can argue, you can discuss, right? Or whether it's ideal to see it's leave with only this handful of people who've been selected very carefully through various mechanisms. It's something you can argue. Even you probably heard of various possibilities across different countries in the world at different times. The leading to a certain possibilities of autocratic nature of individuals being acting. So that's why they sometimes argue even the central banks leaving with a limited number of elite group of people would be not right, and that is not democratic. So they say it's undemocratic, and they simply say that's why central banks' actions also to be monitored and overseen by another agency. So if that's the case, there are used in different countries. They have a parliamentary supervision in terms of whether they perform their activities in line with established objectives, how successful they are in achieving those objectives. So this has been continued for a continuous basis. Then unaccountable. They say the central banks or the monetary boards or the board of governors are not accountable to anybody. I think this we explained, detailedly discussed. That also not necessarily right in today's context. And then the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. They say it's very difficult because monetary policy would pursue achieving monetary policy objectives, whereas the fiscal policy would pursue to achieve fiscal policy objectives. Yes, that's how it should be. But there should be some coordination between fiscal and monetary policies in terms of guiding the economy in line with these competing policy interests. Why I said competing policy interest, when monetary policy required increasing interest rates, you probably see fiscal policy might not be in favor, because fiscal policy would always prefer low interest rates to be applied, simply because if you're having a large budget deficits to be financed, any increase in interest rates would have negative spillovers to the budgetary process. So they would not favor. But the monetary policy would do that by looking at the building inflationary pressures. If you increase interest rates only, you can actually let the economy to soft land, not let economy to hard land. It's damaging. So the monetary policy would say, by making the monetary policy conditions tighter, they wanted to manage the inflation, because inflation would ultimately decide what the interest rate should be. You know, Fisher equation. We discussed Fisher equation. Nominal interest rates are a function of expected inflation plus real interest rates. Okay. So the interest rates, again, inbuilt. The inflation is inbuilt inside interest rate. So the monetary policy action would bring in orderly interest rate structures over the medium term, not necessarily introducing a monetary policy action today and expect interest rates to adjust tomorrow. No. It would happen for the short end. I mean, the short term overnight interest rates, 1 day interest rates, 1 week interest rates, yes. But longer term interest rates would have the other repercussions also playing a role. So the argument is the difficulty in terms of coordination between fiscal and monetary policies. Right? There are certain restrictions in terms of these conflicting objectives being sit with each other when the different decisions being established in different arrangements. But in Sri Lanka's case, the Treasury Secretary sits as a member of the Monetary Board. So he brings in the inputs from government or the fiscal side of the Monetary Board consideration. And that establishes a great deal of coordination, because fiscal policy wanted to do this. That would not be challenging the monetary policy direction. When the monetary policy wanted to do something, how that been influencing fiscal policy, and that could be communicated back to the fiscal policy authorities. That's there with such a coordination. But in advanced economies, sometimes there are no existence of fiscal policy authorities in monetary policy decision making bodies. They're being kept separately because they have conflicting objectives. Right? So that's something they argue for, so-called case against independence. And also there's another argument: despite central banks being given independence, they have not used it successfully. The countries who have gone through different inflationary cycles, high inflation, low inflation is fine, but very high inflation, then the economic collapses at different points of time, despite those economies having reasonable independence for central banks. That also been pointed out as a case against independence. So you can argue in favor of case for independence or case against independence on the basis of these yardsticks. It's not right for me to kind of conclude certain things and just bombard you with only one side of the information, but I'm just presenting both for you to kind of, rationally evaluate and look for your position, how best you can argue. I have given a lot of information. Now you can take kind of, pinpoint in favor of case for or case against. Right. Then we look at central bank behavior. There are various views with respect to central bank behavior. One view of government behavior is that bureaucracies serve the public interest. That is the public interest view. The bureaucracies established in countries, or the governments established in countries, they serve the public interest. What public wants, that's what they do. This is the public interest view expressed in literature. Okay. Yet some develop a theory of bureaucratic behavior that suggests that other factors, that's what influence bureaucracies to operate, not necessarily public interest view. We'll get into that. Okay, it's not public interest, but there are various other factors. That's what drive bureaucratic behavior. Right? This is, in a way, this theory of bureaucratic behavior may be a useful guide to think of how and what ways that motivates the Fed or other central banks to behave. It's a way in which now you can look at it, whether the public interest drives or other motives that drives the behavior of these institutions. Right? So the theory of bureaucratic behavior suggests its objective is to maximize its own welfare, not public interest, but their own welfare related to power and prestige. Right? So it's a kind of, argument that these bureaucratic behavior tries to maximize their own welfare. Right? So to say that they fight to preserve their power and prestige. To say that even the autonomy, that is independence, they want independence not necessarily to drive the objectives referred in the legislations, and not necessarily to not let political authority to influence inflationary bias, but they want the independence to preserve their autonomy, their independence of power and prestige. Because of this reason, they do not conflict with powerful groups. They do not conflict with parliament. They do not conflict with, let's say, ministries, the political authority, or the president. They try to accommodate them also, while mindful of the fact that they need their power and prestige being maintained. That's what the theory of bureaucratic behavior tries to argue, not necessarily the public interest view, but the theory of bureaucratic behavior. But at the same time, the altruism is also not ruled out. So to say that they have concerns of well-being of overall economy, yes. They are mindful of well-being of overall stakeholders, but the priority is often the power and prestige. So that's one way of explaining some of the behavior. But it's up to you. You can now argue, judge on the basis of what we were discussing all throughout. So that's being said, we also look at some of the leading central banks across the globe. Apart from what we were discussing in terms of Federal Reserve and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Now you can see the structure and independence of the ECB. ECB is the European Central Bank. Here, the ECB was born recently. You know, the European Union and all Eurozone arguments establishment is more recent. I don't recall precise year. You can actually Google and find it out, right? So to say that Eurozone and the European Union was established, it was in my mind, at my fingertips, but it's not coming straight away. That's why I didn't mention, but yes, I'll see that as it might come to my mind again, I'll repeat it. But what I'm simply saying is it's a recent, very recent. The arguments in late 90s and early 2000s for the establishment of ECB. And this was patterned very much after the structure of Federal Reserve. You know, in Federal Reserve, number of central banks, Federal Reserve banks in US, equaling to 12, managed through the centralized board of governors, maybe sitting in Washington, as we all seen, and here in the Fed Reserve pattern being followed by ECB, where the European Union members are having their own central banks in their respective jurisdictions. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, you name it, they have their own central banks in their countries. But They all now not independent central banks as such, but they are part of the European Central Bank, headquartered in Frankfurt, Germany. And the centralized headquartered ECB is the one make decision with respect to the operations of all the member central banks. That means central banks from each country play a similar role to Fed Reserve banks in different Fed Reserve districts. Right? So the arrangement is no different to Federal Reserve's arrangement that we discussed. Then you see here, like Board of Governors, here you have an executive board. Right? So executive board consists of president, vice president, and 4 other members. And this number of members are repetitively at discussions to expand with new members coming in, new European Union members, new countries add into the European Union. So there's a possibility that this been expanded. And currently the president is the French former finance minister and former IMF managing director, right? She's heading the executive board as the president of ECB, right? So the term once appointed as members of the executive board is 8 years, single term, non-renewable. Then this executive board, while act as main decision-making body, there's a governing council also in the ECB, like FOMC in the case of Fed Reserve Bank. Executive board like Board of Governors, 7 members, also governing council, 12 members. Board of Governors plus 5 other members, 5 presidents of Fed Reserve banks we discussed. So the structure, right? So in the executive board, it's 6, but it's expandable based on some of the discussions now happening with the ECB. Governing councils, I'm not precisely having the number, how many members there, but it's bigger than the executive board. So you see here, right? They control their own budgets, national central banks, and the budget of the ECB. There's various ways through which they generate income, as we were discussing of the revenue independence of central banks. The ECB also has significant revenue independence. And because of this operation through different national central banks, that's in respect to countries, although European Union is a single entity, you see ECB is a single entity, but it's the national central banks located in respect to countries of the European Union. Therefore, the monetary policy operation not centralized but decentralized to the great extent and implemented through the national central banks within the broader directions, the guidelines established by the ECB. But interestingly, in other central banks that we discussed up to now, they also do the financial system regulation and supervision. But in ECB's case, they are not doing it. They leave it out to independent agencies in the European Union. For instance, the Financial services authorities, FSAs, in those countries often see the regulation part, supervision part, not necessarily the central bank, but they have given substantive independence for the national central banks to decide who should be the financial supervisors, regulators in the case of ECB structure. Right. So to say the governing council's arrangement, they meet monthly, as I said, in the headquartered ECB in Frankfurt, Germany. Right, it's 12 national bank heads and 6 executive members. You know the executive council, 6, and there's additional 12 members, so altogether it's 18. And here too, the operations by consensus. It's not necessarily vote across the governing councils, not looking at majority. At consensus, everybody agrees often for the decisions arrived by these members. Then the ECB, in terms of operations, are mainly interest rate driven. They target a particular interest rate. They assume that interest rate is ideal to manage the inflation and the financial market conditions in the European Union. They decide the target rate and they operate closer to that, maybe slightly higher, slightly lower, depends on market conditions. And they actually clarified what drive them to make that decision, on what basis that they have arrived at decision, and how best they wanted to see that decisions being implemented, any deviations, what drives, all kind of questions taken from the stakeholders, particularly the media, when it comes to its operations. And as new countries join, as I was mentioning, they look at a little bit of expansion as well as rotation of members, like what you have seen in Fed Reserve. Not all the countries are members all the time. They had to have on rotation because they can't have all 12 members being appointed from 12 countries when the number is 20 odd now. I think it's 27 now. Yeah. So you have to have some rotation within the system that they are discussing. New countries may join, some countries may leave out. That's also possible. Okay. So the governing council is maintained on that basis in the case of ECB. And very interestingly, the argument for independence when it comes to ECB, they conclude this is most independent in terms of the central banks in the world. Why? Effectively, ECB is no single countries. It is entirety of European Union. So the people or the members of decision making is coming from different countries and not necessarily sometimes linked with so-called patriotism, nationalism, all kind of things. Even if they have such, the decisions makes at ECB would not necessarily matters to them, as the decisions are often looked at overall European zone, European Union's consideration. So that they are very much independent. They will not necessarily influenced by independent congresses, parliaments, or senates, or the presidents of respective countries. So the European Parliament, European system of parliaments have a say, but they are not necessarily influential like independent central banks or the country's parliamentary oversight in terms of how they are operating. As we said, again, the members of the executive board have long terms, 8-year terms, non-renewable. They have the budgetary independence. They don't have much flexibility in terms of goal independence. They've been established with price stability objective. And this price stability objective being also came for a lot of debate during financial crisis 2008-9, because ECB was empowered with price stability. At times, the argument was they were late to respond to the spillovers of financial crisis from US subprime, US financial market challenges, and the global crisis that they have faced. So that's an interesting argument. And subsequently, ECB become very much flexible in terms of some of the operational consideration, but still the goal remained price stability. They started having liquidity injections, even reserve remuneration, because we discussed reserves are non-remunerated, but ECB started remunerating part of their reserves, smaller return. And even the interest rates been kept at negative interest rates during financial crisis period and aftermath. Not positive, negative. But you have to see it differently. I mean, when you say negative, yes, it's minus. But the thing is, you have to see real interest rate perspective when inflation is much more negative. Then you see a positive interest rate. Okay, so these were, you can just put these negatives to the equation and see the Fisher equation, and you will arrive at a very interesting number. And the ECB's independence is so strong. ECB is established, European Union is established through the Charter, Maastricht Treaty. Everybody agreed and settled, but very difficult to change because it's not like a parliamentary. All the countries in European Union agreed for the charter. On that basis, the establishment was made. So it's not right and easy for them to change without everybody is again agreeing. So it's a very interesting arrangement. At times been welcome for the independence and flexibility in operation, but at the same time during crisis periods criticized for delay, slow in executing required facilitations, like some of the other central banks like Fed quickly responded for the developments in the market. Then the other central banks, main central banks in the world, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, Bank of Japan. Bank of Japan also gained more independence through Bank of Japan law in 1998. Prior to that, even still to some extent, very much operating with close coordination with the Ministry of Finance. So they gained some and more clarity in terms of their independence in 1998 with the new Bank of Japan law. But generally, all around the world, the trend is in favor of independence. Of course, the central banks are mindful and they have been introduced with checks and balances of what they do, how they've been reviewed, and things like that. But interestingly, more in favor of independence in recent times. So with that, we can conclude the discussion on particularly on central bank structure, independence, and how they operate and things like that. Any questions before we move to the next very, very important topic on money supply process? Any questions, you can raise it or you can share it in the chat mode. And also, I wanted to check with you all the possibility that next Saturday and the following Saturday, until 24th, I'll not be in the country, so there's a possibility that we will not be able to have usual Saturday classes. So starting on Tuesday, would that be all right to have the classes from 7 to 9 in the evening? Let's say Tuesday, next Tuesday, 7 to 9. That's one possibility. Or we can have Wednesday, the same time, 7 to 9.
So Wednesday is better.
Right. The others? Right. Right. So we'll try to fix it. Next Wednesday, I'll keep IBSL informed, and they will keep you all updated. Once the Wednesday's window been followed, we'll try to see the communication from IBSL, because 2 consecutive Saturdays, next and the following, I'll not be around. So we might not have those Saturdays for the time being, but keep a close eye on IBSL's communication. So if a window arises, I'll keep them updated, even having a session being outside if there's a possibility. But for the time being, we'll have one on Wednesday, 7 to 9 p.m. Okay. So 19 to 21 hours next Wednesday. So that's the message can be. And if you all don't have any questions with respect to the central bank that we discussed, we can move to the money supply process. I believe you have the handouts already available, and this area is very interesting, as well as you see some computations also there, but these computations are reasonably straightforward. What is interesting here is you have to understand the fact that the movements in money supply. But before that, I'll tell you, money supply management, if not control of money supply, to some extent was the fashion in monetary policy operations, especially in 80s and 90s. But still it's there, still it's being followed, but interestingly now more in favor of interest rate driven monetary policy operations. So you set the interest rate X and let money supply to adjust to make that X is applicable in general interest rate structures in financial markets. So you adjust money supply to facilitate that X. Prior to that, often looked at quantum of money. Money supply is the quantum of money available at any given moment in time in the economy. So the movements in money supply, its effect interest rates and overall health of the economy and effectively all of us. So to say that higher the money quantity available in the economy, it is expected that naturally the interest rates tend to be in favor of lower side. because the quantum of money is very much. And as a result, the supply is more than the demand. What happens to the prices, you probably know. Supply of money is more, invariably results in interest rates to tend to be lower than when you see demand for money. What happens there is the prices would be closer to 100, right? So you probably see when you are borrowing 100, right, you require to pay 100, you probably borrowing very closer to 100, close to par when it comes to discounted financial assets like treasury bills, or for that matter, the money market instruments that probably be offered. So the effective movement in money supply would contribute to the movements in interest rates, and then as a result, overall health of the economy. Because if the cost of financing is low, that itself facilitate expansion in economic activities. Because of these far-reaching effects on economic activity, it is important to understand how the money supply is determined. Who controls, what causes it to change, how is control being improved. There are various ways through which the central banks try to kind of, influence the money supply through which the interest rate structures. Right, so we try to answer these questions in this section and the subsequent sections that we probably be discussing. Right, that the mechanism that determines where the money supply should be, that is also being discussed here. And you probably see the deposits of banks remain one of the largest components of money supply. And we can understand how these deposits created in the first step, as well as in this chapter we also look at how the banking system creates these deposits and describes the basic principles of money supply in this exercise. So this area is very important for your understanding as well as for the examination purposes. So keep an eye on these very closely and try to understand, read through, try to take down whatever explanations for your easy understanding that would help you to kind of, get a very clear feel on this subject. You see, there are three major players in the money supply process. Always the central bank, the banks, that means financial intermediaries, then depositors, if not stakeholders, individuals and institutions in any economy. When we say money supply, that include cash, coins.
Do you share the presentation?
Hello.
Excuse me, are you sharing a presentation? Okay.
Yes. I'm sharing a presentation actually.
Okay, sir, got it. Thanks.
Can see, isn't it?
Yeah. Now can see. Sorry.
Yeah. And also the presentation is already available, and they have shared with the bank. IBSL has already shared that. Right. So you see this The money supply include cash, coins, and balances held in checking and saving accounts. That means the more or less one could say current accounts in different parlance, checking accounts. Not necessarily current account. Checking accounts is the accounts that you have where you can withdraw money at will. Saving accounts, of course, has some considerations in terms of terms established. You have to maintain minimum balances. And sometimes saving accounts also could have term deposits. You probably deposits for a certain duration. So you change before that, that means the applicable compensation structures changes. You establish a fixed account of 2 years, but after 6 months you want to withdraw, probably you will not get the 2-year fixed deposit interest rates, but a different lower interest rate structure. And other near money substitutes being looked at in terms of money supply in aggregates. Right? So when you say money supply, that is the total value of money available in an economy at a point of time, end of, let's say, September, October, or end of December, that's the end of a particular year. What's the stock of money available in the economy? That's the money supply. That's why I said quantum of money, the volume. That comprises the things that I mentioned. And I remember I was presenting you different monetary aggregates. Small m2, that means m0 to m1, m2, m2b, m3, m4. There are various, I mean, even you can expand it to m5, m6. You can go on like that. But effectively, the smallest m represent the more liquid, highest liquid component of the money supply. And then you build the money supply by adding lesser liquid components, right? So every time high powered money, that is currency in circulation plus, that is the monetary base, currency in circulation plus the bank's deposits with the central bank comes the most liquid component of the money supply. So often M0 or M1 to some extent being considered as high-powered money. We discussed that a few lectures before. Right. So when you say, it's again high-powered money that we are presenting here also, so you will be refreshing some of these details. When you say a balance sheet of a central bank, we take it from the central bank perspective, and it's easy for you to understand from the bank's perspective too. Right? So the central bank's book, liabilities, the most important two liabilities in central bank's books is the currency in circulation. Both notes and coins in public's hand. Whatever you have in your wallets, whatever you have kept inside wherever in your house, residence, whatever that you call it. So this is the currency in the hands of public. When I say currency, that includes coins also, but coins are generally in absolute value sense is small compared to the value of the total currency in circulation in notes form. Okay, so the currency in circulation is one of the very important and biggest liabilities in a central bank's book. Then you see the reserves. This is actually not central bank's money. This is the money the banks kept with the central bank. And also there's a component called wall cash. That's also part of the reserves. This is not necessarily the reserve component. In addition to that, there are balances arising from various possibilities, even due to reserves. But now, because of deposits have, let's say, declined, but the banks have kept more reserves in the previous cycle. There's a reserve computation periods, right? Middle of the month, end of the month, the Thursdays like being kind of set by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Maybe other central banks have different cycles. So they look at this reserve maintenance cycles. Based on your deposits, you have to either bring in new reserves or your reserves already maintained is sufficient and you have excess. So that become part of whole cash. Or there may be other forms of cash being maintained with the central banks by these banks in their accounts. Those were receipts arising from various other operations that the banks have with the rest of the financial industry. So main liabilities in the books of central bank is the currency in circulation plus these reserves maintained by the financial intermediaries. The asset side of the central bank is also very important. They have securities. Securities in the form of, let's say, treasury bills. Central bank purchase treasury bills from the market and through which that create a financial asset in its book and it's the liability of the government, right? So basically, the securities in central bank's book, even foreign securities like US treasuries, are part of assets of the central bank or the Fed Reserve. Right? And these securities earn interest, yes. That itself based on sometimes not necessarily the central banks invest in these securities by looking at the interest income. No, that's not the purpose. It is often to inject supply money, right? And to facilitate at times to meet government's financing requirements. Not purely looking at the interest return as one general investor would do in terms of its investment in securities. And the other important asset in a Fed or the central bank's balance sheet is loans to financial institutions. All these financial intermediaries have various borrowing arrangements with the central banks. Everything they borrow under a discount window, under lender of last resort facility, let's say overnight lending arrangements, all the loans that the central bank extend to financial intermediaries are assets in central bank's book. Right? The banks or the financial intermediaries who borrow has to settle them. So this is generally the asset side and the liability side you will come across in the central bank's book. Take it from the central bank's book because it's very easy for you to understand as we try to explain movements in these with financial intermediaries or for that matter general public as we move on with explanation. Then I also mentioned about the monetary base. In other words, high-powered money. We already discussed about this in one of our previous lectures. The monetary base, high-powered money, is also a very important component, and control of this also matters in terms of controlling the money supply very effectively by the central banks. So when we say the monetary base, total amount of currency that is either circulated in the hands of the public or in the commercial bank's deposit held in the central bank's reserves. Exactly the liability side of the central bank balance sheets that we were talking in the previous slide. And as I said, this measure of money supply, this monetary base, typically only includes the most liquid component. Right? So when I say monetary base, again, say high-powered money, there's no problem. This is the same, but differently explained. If not, you might see in different literature, they interchangeably use these words, high-powered money versus monetary base. So when we say monetary base, it is C plus R. C is currency in circulation. R is total reserves in the banking system. Simple, but very big meaning behind it. Take it as C plus R. That would repeat as we move on, and that would be very helpful if you understand it in terms of trying to kind of, work through some of discussions that we will have with respect to this money supply process. Right. Then you see the open market. Open market operations of a central bank is effectively contributes to exchange of securities and money supply, if not you particularly establish in terms of reserves. Because central bank would not go and give the money to a party who transact with the open market of the central bank operations. As often you have open market operations window or a department in most of the central banks. They don't go and give money to somebody who transacts with the central bank. What they do is they credit the account of the counterparty maintained with the central bank. And central banks also do not necessarily go and transact with individual customers. They transact with the banks or the financial intermediaries who are invariably members of central banks or the Federal Reserve System, as we were discussing. So here you understand the fact that when Fed or the open market purchases from general public, in US that's possible, but not necessarily in most of the developing and frontier economies. But you can interpret it. Banks is selling the general public's holding of securities to the central bank. You know, when central bank purchases a security, where was the security in central bank's books? In the asset side. So as soon as you purchase, by the amount of purchase, the securities increases. So you can see the Fed Reserve account here, the securities increases. Let's say this transaction is 100 million US dollars plus 100 million US dollars. Central bank purchase, securities increase. For this, central bank has to do what? They have to pay to the seller. Seller may be Mr. T or Mr. X, Mr. Y. But central bank would not have his account, but his bank's account, his financial intermediary's account. So what they do is the account maintained with the central bank being facilitated or increased by so-called reserves equivalent of securities transaction. So the reserves are the liabilities of the central bank. So the equivalent $100 million being established in the liability side. And you see the central bank's account, the securities assets, reserves liabilities, in asset and liability side being established, and the books are balanced. Then the banking system, for them, whatever they keep with the central bank is an asset, can take it out when they require. So central bank has created the reserves for the bank, let's say bank A. In a bank A's books, the reserves are an assets that you see, it's 100 million. And this 100 million is effectively, we discussed central bank is purchasing from general public here. So it is not that bank's own asset, but the general public who maintains account with him. So they establishes a deposit that's in banking's eyes, a liability, deposit with respect to this client. Again, 100 million US dollars. So you see the books are reasonably now very clear in the first round of operations. Okay. Basically, the general public is maintaining the receipts in the Fed's instructions in the account form with the bank, and here this would be very much identical, something that central bank purchased from a bank too. But the structure changes when you kind of move beyond this point, and then adjustments would shape up in terms of how the general public start to behave. Right. Here is now the person already sold the bond to the central bank, maintain his deposits with bank A. But interestingly, now previously he has maintained that in his account, but he cashes the Fed's check or the instruction. Cashes means he converts it into currency. So in the operation of cashing the balance maintained by the particular bank to facilitate providing cash to the client, first thing bank does is he runs down the equivalent amount of his reserves and receives so-called currency in circulation. So it's also a liability in the central bank book. The liability side changes from reserves to currency in circulation. Because if you have 100 million in your books itself, the bank would settle it, no problem. But usually banks kind of, run a very corresponding operation in terms of reasonably big value transactions. So they run down their reserves and get the currency in circulation. So the liability is created because central bank is issuing currency. So in the bank's asset side, they get the currency. Of course, security is been reduced because previously bank had security. That's the, in fact, the general public I was referring here. He had security, bank acted as an intermediary in the process. So he reduced his security because he sold it to the central bank. But in place of the security, he received currency. So it is in his hands now. So effectively, this operation, what you are seeing is reserves have settled, no change. Originally, you see it was created 100, but with the currency adjustment, that 100 gone off, so no change to the reserves. Because they have done this with the general currency in circulation increased by the amount of open market purchase. And what is currency in circulation? MB equals C plus R. So the monetary base increased by the amount of open market purchase. So effectively, you are seeing any open market purchase would have a positive traction to increase the monetary base. Right. So you are seeing here open market purchase. In summary, the effect of an open market purchase on reserves depends on whether the seller of the bond keeps the proceeds from the sale in currency or in deposit form. You have seen that. Until he cashes the check, it was in reserves form. But as soon as he cashed, it converts into currency. So the reserves become almost zero. Change to the reserves, no change effective. The effect of an open market purchase on the monetary base, always positive. Increase the monetary base by the amount of purchase. So that's the conclusion of open market purchase. And the central banks carry out this type of transactions many thousand times to make sure the intended direction of their open market operations to adjust the monetary base through which the money supply process. So this is a good point unless you have questions and clarifications for us to stop today's discussion. Any questions? If not, we are meeting again next Wednesday, 7 p.m. And we will continue discussing the topic that we have highlighted. So until that time, stay safe, have a review of the slides that you have. That would be very helpful for you to understand the rest of the discussions that we are having. Thank you.